lecture IR poster announced an introductory course on philosophy for scientists. I see among you mathematicians, physicists, chemists, biologists, etc., but also specialists in the human sciences and, if they will forgive me, in what are, by convention, known simply as the arts. Little matter, it is either a real experience of a scientific practice or the hope of giving your discipline the form of a science that brings you together, as well as, naturally, the question, what is to be expected of philosophy? You see before you a philosopher. Philosophers took the initiative of organizing this course, having judged it possible, opportune, and useful. Why? Because, being familiar with works on the history of philosophy and of the sciences, and having friends who are scientists, we have arrived at a certain idea of the relations that philosophy necessarily maintains with the sciences. Better still, a certain idea of the relations that philosophy should maintain with the sciences, if it is to serve them rather than enslave them. Better still, because, as a result of an experience external to philosophy and to the sciences, but indispensable to an understanding of their relationship, we have arrived at a certain idea of which philosophy can serve the sciences. And since it is we philosophers who have taken this initiative, it is fitting that we take the first step, by first speaking of our own discipline, philosophy. I will therefore attempt, using terms that are as clear and simple as possible, to give you an initial idea of philosophy. I do not propose to present to you a theory of philosophy but, far more modestly, a description of its manner of being and of its manner of acting, let us say of its practice. Hence the plan of this first lecture. It will consist of two parts. 1. A putting into place of basic notions, culminating in the statement of 20 on philosophical theses. 2. The summary examination of a concrete example in which we will be able to see the majority of these theses exercise their proper philosophical function. Basic notions. This lecture will begin with the statement of a certain number of didactic and dogmatic propositions. These adjectives, I am quite aware, do not have good reputations, but that does not matter. We must not give in to either the fetishism or the counter-fetishism of words. Didactic propositions, for no lecture escapes the circle of pedagogical exposition. To give an idea of a question, it is necessary to begin and hence first to give apparently arbitrary definitions which will only subsequently be justified or demonstrated. Dogmatic propositions. This adjective pertains to the very nature of philosophy. Definition. I call dogmatic any proposition that assumes the form of a thesis. I will add, philosophical propositions are theses and therefore dogmatic propositions. This proposition is itself a philosophical thesis. Hence thesis 1. Philosophical propositions are theses. This thesis is stated in a didactic form. It will be explained and justified later, as we go along. But at the same time I specify that it is a thesis, that is, a dogmatic proposition. I therefore insist, a philosophical proposition is a dogmatic proposition and not simply a didactic proposition. The didactic form is destined to disappear into the exposition, but the dogmatic character persists. We have straightway touched a sensitive point. What does dogmatic really mean, not in general but in our definition? To give a first elementary idea, I will say this. Philosophical theses can be considered dogmatic propositions negatively, insofar as they are not susceptible to demonstration in the strictly scientific sense, in the sense that we speak of demonstration in mathematics or in logic, nor to proof in the strictly scientific sense, in the sense that we speak of proof in the experimental sciences. I then derive from thesis 1 a thesis 2 that explains it. Not being the object of scientific demonstration or proof, philosophical theses cannot be said to be true, demonstrated or proved as in mathematics or in physics. They can only be said to be correct, just. Thesis 2. Every philosophical thesis may be said to be correct or not. What might correct signify? To give an initial idea, the attribute true implies, above all, a relationship to theory. the attribute correct, above all a relationship to practice. Thus, a correct decision, a just, or a correct line. Let us stop a moment. I am simply trying to give you some idea of the form of our lecture. Being a lecture, it states didactic propositions, which are justified later. But being a lecture on philosophy, it didactically states propositions that are necessarily dogmatic propositions, theses. It will be noted that insofar as they are theses, philosophical propositions are theoretical propositions, but insofar as they are correct propositions, these theoretical propositions are haunted by practice. Let me add a paradoxical remark. An entire philosophical tradition since Kant has contrasted dogmatism with criticism. Philosophical propositions have always had the effect of producing critical distinctions, that is, of sorting out or separating ideas from each other, and even of forging the appropriate ideas for making their separation and its necessity visible. Theoretically, this effect might be expressed by saying that philosophy divides, Plato traces lines of demarcation, Lenin, and produces, in the sense of making manifest or visible, distinctions and differences. The entire history of philosophy demonstrates that philosophers spend their time distinguishing between truth and error, between science and opinion, between the sensible and the intelligible, between reason and the understanding, between spirit and matter, etc. They always do it, but they do not say, or only rarely, that the practice of philosophy consists in this demarcation, in this distinction, in this drawing of a line. We say it, and we will say many other things. By recognizing this, by saying it and thinking it, we separate ourselves from them. Even as we take note of the practice of philosophy, we exercise it, but we do so in order to transform it. Therefore philosophy states theses, propositions that give rise neither to scientific demonstration nor to proof in the strict sense, but to rational justifications of a particular, distinct type. This thesis has two important and immediate implications. 1. Philosophy is a discipline different from the sciences, as the nature of its propositions will suffice here to indicate. 2. It will be necessary to explain and justify this difference, and in particular to think the proper, specific modality of philosophical propositions. What distinguishes a thesis from a scientific proposition? From the outset, we can see that we have touched on an important primary problem. What is philosophy? What distinguishes it from the sciences? And what makes it distinct from them? I will leave these questions to one side. I simply wanted in two theses to give you an initial idea. What might these philosophers who are speaking to you be thinking of? A few preliminary words were necessary. But if we were now to get acquainted? You scientists did not come here to hear what I said a moment ago. You did not really know what to expect. You came for different reasons, let us say out of friendship, interest, curiosity. Let us leave aside friendship and all that might pertain to the comforts of this place, the École Normale. You came out of curiosity and interest. Difficult feelings to define. I do not believe I am wrong, however, in saying that your interest and your curiosity center around two poles, one negative, the other positive. And that whilst the negative is well defined, the positive is rather vague. Let us see. 1. The negative pole. Let us be good sports. Philosophers at work. It is well worth going out of your way to have a close look at such a spectacle. What spectacle? Why, comedy. Bergson, Larrera, superscript 1 has explained and Chaplin has shown that, ultimately, comedy is always a matter of a man missing a step or falling into a hole. With philosophers you know what to expect, at some point they will fall flat on their faces. Behind this mischievous or malevolent hope there is a genuine reality. Ever since the time of fools and Plato, philosophy and philosophers have been falling into wells. Slapstick. But that is not all. for ever since Plato philosophy has been falling within its own realm. A second-degree fall, into a philosophical theory of falling. Let me spell it out. The philosopher attempts in his philosophy to descend from the heavenly realm of ideas and get back to material reality, to descend from theory and get back to practice. A controlled fall, but a fall nevertheless. Realizing that he is falling, he attempts to catch his balance in a theory of falling, a descending dialectic, etc., and falls just the same. He falls twice. Twice as funny. Let us be good sports. Philosophers make a lot of fuss about nothing. They are intellectuals without a practice. Far removed from everything. Their discourse is nothing but a commentary on, and a disavowal of, this distance. They try, at a remove, to grasp the real in their words, to insert it in systems. Words succeed words, systems succeed systems, while the world continues its course as before. Philosophy? The discourse of theoretical impotence on the real work of others, scientific, artistic, political, etc., practice. Philosophy, what it lacks in titles it makes up for in pretension. This pretension produces beautiful discourses. So, philosophy as pretension will figure among the fine arts. An art. We are back to the spectacle. This time it is dance, dancing so as not to fall. Yes, we are going to fall flat on our faces. Note that scientists, like all men engaged in a real practice, can also fall flat on their faces. But they do so in a particular way. When they fall, they calmly register the fact, ask themselves why, rectify their errors and get on with their work. But when a philosopher falls flat on his face, things are different, for he falls flat on his face within the very theory which he is setting forth in order to demonstrate that he is not falling flat on his face. He picks himself up in advance. How many philosophers do you know who admit to having been mistaken? A philosopher is never mistaken. In short, your air of amused curiosity masks a certain comic and derisive idea of philosophy, the conviction that philosophy has no practice, no object, that its domain is but words and ideas, a system that might be brilliant, but which exists in a void. You have to admit that even if, out of politeness, you refrain from saying so, you do derive a certain pleasure from entertaining such ideas, or at least analogous ones. Well, I will say right away that for my part I endorse all these ideas, for they are neither gratuitous nor arbitrary. But I will, naturally, take them up, in the form of theses, for in their way they are philosophical and contribute to the definition of philosophy. Thesis 3. Philosophy does not have as its object real objects or a real object in the sense that a science has a real object. Thesis 4. Philosophy does not have an object in the sense that a science has an object. Thesis 5. Although philosophy has no object, there exist philosophical objects, objects internal to philosophy. Thesis 6. Philosophy consists of words organized into dogmatic propositions called theses. Thesis 7. Theses are linked to each other in the form of a system. Thesis 8. Philosophy falls flat on its face in a particular, different, way, for others. In its own view, philosophy is not mistaken. There is no philosophical error. Here again I am proceeding didactically and dogmatically. The explanations will come later. But you suspect that, when I grant all your points, I am holding something back. You naturally suspect that in advancing theses on philosophy in general, and in stating them as theses, I am saying what is, but at the same time keeping my distance, I am already adopting a philosophical position with regard to philosophy in general. What position? That too will become clear later. 2. The positive pole in truth, you have not come here solely for the pleasure of seeing us perform our comically clumsy acrobatics. For my own part, I agree with you that we have come to fall flat on our faces, but in an unexpected manner that distinguishes us from the majority of philosophers, and knowing it perfectly well, so as to disappear into our intervention. You see that we are already beginning to distance ourselves from Thesis 8. And what about you? What attracts you and keeps you here? I would say, a sort of expectation, questions that have not been formulated and to which you have no answers, some well-founded, others perhaps false. But each one expecting or demanding an answer, either a positive answer or an answer that exposes the pointlessness of the question. In a very general sense, this expectation, coming as much from scientists as from specialists in the arts, can be stated in the following form. Leaving details to one side, we will come back to them. All these unanswered questions give rise to the following question: is there not, after all, in spite of everything, something to be hoped for from philosophy? When all is said and done, might there not be in philosophy something of relevance to our concerns? To the problems of our scientific or literary practice? This kind of question is undoubtedly in the air, because you are here. Not simply out of curiosity, but because it might be in your interest to be here. With your permission, we are going to proceed in order, going from the most superficial to the most profound, and to this end, to distinguish 3 levels and the reasons for this interest. A first level. First of all, there is what can only be called the fashion for interdisciplinarity. These days, an encounter between representatives of different disciplines is supposed to hold all the promise of a miracle cure. Scientists are already holding such meetings, and the CNRS² itself recommends them. It is virtually the main slogan of modern times. Cities have already been built, conceived for the sole purpose of housing large communities of scientists. Princeton, Atomgarad. Interdisciplinarity is also very much the done thing at all possible levels in the human sciences. So why not here? Why not an encounter between philosophers, scientists and literary specialists? Let us go further. Would not the presence of philosophers give meaning to this interdisciplinary encounter? Given that he is eccentric to all scientific disciplines, might not the philosopher, by his very nature, be the artisan of interdisciplinarity because he is, whether he likes it or not, a specialist in interdisciplinarity? Behind the term interdisciplinarity, there may certainly be undeniably definite and important objective achievements. We will speak of them. But behind the generality of the slogan of interdisciplinarity, there is also an ideological myth. For the sake of clarity, I will take note of this by stating 3 theses. Thesis 9. An ideological proposition is a proposition that, while it is the symptom of a reality other than that of which it speaks, is a false proposition to the extent that it concerns the object of which it speaks. Thesis 10. In the majority of cases, the slogan of interdisciplinarity is a slogan that today expresses an ideological proposition. Thesis 11. Philosophy is neither an interdisciplinary discipline nor the theory of interdisciplinarity. I will indicate in passing, it is clear that with these theses we are moving ever further from the domain of a definition of philosophy in general. We are taking part in debates internal to philosophy concerning a stake and due interdisciplinarity in order to mark our own philosophical position. Is it possible to define philosophy without adopting a position within philosophy? Remember this simple question. Second level. Here we encounter the problems posed by the massive development of the sciences and technologies, and this is a much more serious matter. Problems internal to each science, and problems posed by the relations between different sciences, relations of the application of one science to another. Problems posed by the birth of new sciences in zones that might retrospectively be said to be border zones, for example chemistry, physics, biochemistry, etc. There have always been problems internal to scientific practice. What is new is that today they seem to be posed in global terms, recasting earlier sciences, redrawing former borderlines. They are also posed in global terms from the social point of view, the theoretical problems of strategy and tactics in research, the problems of the material and financial conditions and implications of this strategy and tactics. And so one wonders, can there be strategy and tactics in research? Can there be a direction of research? Can research be directed, or must it be free? In accordance with what ought it to be directed? Purely scientific objectives, or social, that is, political, objectives, the prioritization of sectors, with all the financial, social and administrative consequences that implies, not only funding, but also relations with industry, with politics, etc.? And if these questions are successively resolved on a general level, what will their possible and necessary effects be at the level of research itself? It is possible to think a strategy and tactics internal to each research program. Are there methods of scientific discovery, that permit research to be guided? These are all problems before which scientists are hesitant or divided. One has only, for example, to read the official and technocratic discourses from the colloque d'Econ and the criticisms voiced by the young scientists of Paris. Two extreme positions, absolute freedom on the one hand, planned research on the other. Between the two, the technocratic solution of Kahn, inspired by American and Soviet models. On the horizon, the Chinese solution. When faced with the complexity and difficulty of these massive problems, where it is no longer simply a question of immediate scientific practice, the researcher in his laboratory, but of the social process of the production of knowledges, of its organization and its politics, the question of who will govern it, one wonders, might not the philosopher by chance have something to say, a semblance of an answer to these questions? Something to say, for example, on the important theoretical and political alternative of freedom or planning in research? On the social and political conditions and goals of the organization of research? Or even on the method of scientific discovery? Why not? Because such an expectation responds precisely to something that pertains to the pretension of philosophy. Those who laughingly say that philosophers dabble in everything may find that the joke is on them. To put it in more elevated terms, these dabblers in everything may have certain ideas about the whole, about the way things are linked to each other, about the totality. This is an old tradition that goes back to Plato, for whom the philosopher is the man who sees the connection and articulation of the whole. The philosopher's object is the whole, Kant, Hegel. He is the specialist of the totality. Similar expectations are found amongst literary specialists who are trying to give birth to sciences. Might not the philosopher have some idea about the way the sciences, the arts, literature, economics and politics are related to each other, interconnected and articulated into a whole? There is a certain truth behind this expectation and in this tradition. The philosopher is certainly concerned with questions that are not unrelated to the problems of scientific practice, to the problems of the process of the production of knowledges, to political and ideological problems, to the problem of relations between all these problems. Whether he has the right to be so concerned is another question. He is. But philosophical questions are not scientific problems. Traditional philosophy can provide answers to its own questions. It does not provide answers to scientific, or other, problems, in the sense in which scientists solve their problems. Which means, philosophy does not resolve scientific problems in the place of science. Philosophical questions are not scientific problems. Here again, we are adopting a position within philosophy. Philosophy is not a science, nor a fortiori science. It is neither the science of the crises of science, nor the science of the whole. Philosophical questions are not ipso facto scientific problems. I will immediately record this position in the form of theses. Thesis 12. Philosophy states theses that effectively concern most of the sensitive points regarding the problems of the totality. But because philosophy is neither a science nor the science of the whole, it does not provide the solution to these problems. It intervenes in another way, by stating theses that contribute to opening the way to a correct position with regard to these problems. Thesis 13. Philosophy states theses that assemble and produce, not scientific concepts, but philosophical categories. Thesis 14. The set of theses and philosophical categories that they produce can be grouped under, and function as, a philosophical method. Thesis 15. In its modality and its functioning, philosophical method is different to a scientific method. See third level here. Finally, are the last reasons for your interest in philosophy. Behind purely scientific problems we have all felt the presence of historical events of immense import. Official vocabulary sanctions this fact: mutations in the sciences, moving into the space age, the revolution in civilization, from Teilhard de Chardin to Forestier. All the political problems that are known to be more or less linked to these questions: the backdrop, the USA, the USSR, China. Real political and social revolutions. The feeling that we have reached a turning point in the history of humanity gives renewed force to the old question: where do we come from? Where are we? And behind those questions, the question of questions: where are we going? A question to be understood in every sense of the term, and in all its aspects. It interrogates not only the world and science: where is history going? Where is science going? Exploitation, well-being, nuclear war. But also each one of us: what is our place in the world? What place can we occupy in the world today, given its uncertain future? What attitude should we adopt with regard to our work, to the general ideas that guide or hinder our research and may guide our political action? Behind the question, where are we going? There is an urgent, crucial practical question: how do we orientate ourselves? Which direction should we follow? What is to be done? For intellectuals, scientists or literary specialists, the question takes a precise form: what place does our activity occupy in the world? What role does it play? What are we as intellectuals in this world? For what is an intellectual, if not the product of a history and a society in which the division of labor imposes upon us this role and its blinkers? Have not the revolutions that we have known or seen announced the birth of a different type of intellectual? If so, what is our role in this transformation? The meaning of history, our place in the world, the legitimacy of our profession, so many questions which, whenever the world shatters old certitudes, touch upon and always end up reviving the old religious question of destiny. Where are we going? And that soon becomes a different question. It becomes, what is man's destiny? Or, what are the ultimate ends of history? We are then close to saying, philosophy must have something of an answer in mind. From the whole to the destiny, origins and ultimate ends, the way is short. The philosophy that claimed to be able to conceive of the whole also claimed to be able to pronounce upon man's destiny and the ends of history. What should we do? What may we hope for? To these moral and religious questions traditional philosophy has responded in one form or another by a theory of ultimate ends which mirrors a theory of the radical origin of things. We will not play on this expectation. Once again I will respond with theses, by taking sides, as always, in philosophy. Everyone will understand that the philosophy in question in these theses is not philosophy in general nor a fortiori the philosophy of ultimate ends. Thesis 16. Philosophy does not answer questions about origins and ultimate ends, for philosophy is neither a religion nor a moral doctrine. Thesis 17. The question of origins and of ultimate ends is an ideological proposition. Thesis 18. questions of origins and ultimate ends are ideological propositions drawn from religious and moral ideologies, which are practical ideologies. Thesis 19. Practical ideologies are complex formations which shape notions, representations, images into behavior, conduct, attitude, gestures. The ensemble functions as practical norms that govern the attitude and the concrete positions men adopt towards the real objects and real problems of their social and individual existence, and towards their history. Thesis 20. The primary function of philosophy is to draw a line of demarcation between the ideological of the ideologies on the one hand, and the scientific of the sciences on the other. See what has happened. The question of the meaning of history, of the destiny of man, has projected a new character to the front of the stage, the ideological. Not in the form that we have already encountered in Thesis 9, an ideological proposition is, which was purely formal, but in another form, that which relates an ideological proposition to its birthplace, practical ideology, thus to a social reality foreign and external to scientific practice. And see what happens. With ideology, as related to practical ideologies, a third character enters the stage. Up to now we have had two of them, philosophy and science, and our central question was, what distinguishes philosophy from the sciences? What gives philosophy its own nature, distinct from the nature of the sciences? Now a new question arises, what distinguishes the scientific from the ideological? A question that must be either confronted or replaced by another, but which, from the outset, has its effects upon philosophy. For the philosophy within which we have taken a position is truly haunted by practical ideologies, since it reflects them in its theory of ultimate ends, be they religious or moral. Let us simply note this point. From now on, philosophy is defined by a double relation, to the sciences and to practical ideologies. This is not speculation. If we hope to receive anything from philosophy, we must know what it can impart, and in order to know that, we must know how it is done, upon what it depends and how it functions. We advance, step by step, we discover what philosophy is by practicing it. There is no other way. And our position is coherent. We have said that philosophy is above all practical. You see the result. Simply taking seriously and examining not only, shall we say, the negative, or in any case mischievous, reasons, but also the positive reasons, however imprecise, that you might have had to come and hear a philosopher in the discharge of his public duties, has provoked this result, an avalanche of theses. Do not be frightened, we will enter into the details. To an example, the best way to avoid the aridity of theses is, of course, to show how they function with an example. This is not an illustration. Philosophy cannot be illustrated or applied. It is exercised, it can be learned only by being practiced, for it exists only in its practice. This point could be stated in the form of a thesis, but I leave that to you. It will be a good practical exercise. In order to show how philosophy functions, how it traces critical lines of demarcation in order to clear a correct way, we will therefore take an example, that of an ideological proposition, that of the slogan of interdisciplinarity. You will see that it is not by chance that the example we have chosen is that of an ideological proposition. I remind you, interdisciplinarity is today a widely diffused slogan which is expected to provide the solution to all sorts of difficult problems in the exact sciences, mathematics and the natural sciences, the human sciences, and other practices. I remind you, an ideological proposition is a proposition which, whilst it is the symptom of a reality other than that of which it speaks, is a false proposition to the extent that it concerns the object of which it speaks. What will the work of philosophy on this ideological proposition consist in? Drawing a line of demarcation between the ideological pretensions of interdisciplinarity and the realities of which it is the symptom. When we have surveyed these realities, then we will see what remains of these ideological pretensions. it is clear that something like interdisciplinarity corresponds to an objective and well-founded necessity when there exists a command that requires the coordinated cooperation of specialists from several branches of the division of labor. When the decision is taken to build a housing estate somewhere or other, a whole series of specialists is gathered together according to the precise needs that dictate their intervention: economists, sociologists, geologists, geographers, architects, and various kinds of engineers. Whatever the results, sometimes such schemes come to nothing. In theory, no one contests the need to go through that process. The interdisciplinarity defined by the technical requirements of a command thus appears to be the obverse of the division of labor, that is, its recomposition in a collective undertaking. May not the same be said of intellectual interdisciplinarity in the sciences when the commands are justified? Formally, yes. Thus, physicists appeal to mathematicians, or biologists call upon the services of mathematicians and chemists, but they always do so to resolve specific problems whose solution requires the intervention of specialists from other disciplines. If what I say is correct, at least as a first approximation, for these are simple notations, I am in the process of making a distinction, therefore of drawing a line of demarcation between a justified recourse to technical and scientific cooperation, which may be defined by the precise demands addressed to specialists from other disciplines for the solution of problems that have emerged in a given discipline, and a different, unwarranted use of the slogan of interdisciplinarity. However, if the generalized, undefined slogan of interdisciplinarity expresses a proposition of an ideological nature, we must consider it as such, false in what it claims to designate, but at the same time a symptom of a reality other than that which it explicitly designates. What, then, is this other reality? Let us see. It is the reality of the effective relations that have either existed for a long time between certain disciplines, whether scientific or literary, or which are in the process of being constituted between older and newer disciplines, for example between mathematics, etc., and the human sciences. Let us examine the case a little more closely. We will differentiate between these cases. 1. Relations between disciplines belonging to the exact sciences. 2. Relations between the exact sciences and the human sciences. 3. Relations between literary disciplines. 1. Relations between the exact sciences vary schematically, and bearing in mind possible objections, I propose to say that there exist two fundamental types of relations: relations of application and relations of constitution. Relations of application. I will distinguish between two such relations: the application of mathematics to the exact sciences and the application of one science to another. As you can see, I am making a distinction. I am drawing a line of demarcation between these two types of application. This distinction is made by philosophy. Relations between mathematics and the natural sciences. Let us immediately note the double aspect of this relation. On the one hand, all the natural sciences are mathematicized; they cannot do without mathematics. This relation of mathematics to the natural sciences might at first sight be considered a relation of application. But a philosophical question immediately arises: how is this application to be conceived? We all have in our heads the common and convenient notion, in reality, an ideological notion, of application as the effect of an impression. One applies a signature under a text, a design on fabric, a stamp on an envelope. An applique is a thing that can be posed on or against something else. The original image of this notion is that of superimposition impression. It implies the duality of objects: what is applied is different from that to which it is applied, and the exteriority, the instrumentality of the first is relative to the second. The common notion of application thus takes us back to the world of technology. Thus, I draw a line of demarcation. It is clear that mathematics is not applied to mathematical physics, nor to experimental physics, nor to chemistry, biology, etc., according to the mode of exteriority, and instrumentality, according to the mode of technology. Mathematics is not, for physics, a simple tool to be used when necessary, or even an instrument, at least given the usual sense of the word, for example, when one speaks of a scientific instrument, and even that remains to be seen. For mathematics is the very existence of theoretical physics, and it is infinitely more than a mere instrument in experimental physics. You can see the practical point of drawing this line of demarcation. In the space that it opens up, it makes visible something that could not be seen. What? Questions. What are we to understand by the category of the application of mathematics to the natural sciences? First question. We will attempt to discuss it, if only to see what philosophy has been able to perceive and what it has missed, and why. Why has it necessarily missed something? But this first question implies another, its counterpart, since by drawing a line we see that application conceals technology. What is technology? What is its field of validity? For this word obviously covers several realities. No doubt there are also differences between the technology of the blacksmith, that of the engineer, and the technical problems that currently dominate a whole series of branches of natural science, physics, chemistry, biology, and therefore lines of demarcation to be drawn. We shall try. But the relationship between mathematics and the natural sciences works both ways. The natural sciences pose problems for mathematics, they have always done so. The application of mathematics to the sciences therefore conceals another, inverse, relation, that by which mathematics is obliged, in order to meet the demands of the sciences, to formulate problems that may be either those of applied mathematics or those of pure mathematics. It is as though mathematics gave back, in a more elaborated form, to the sciences what it received from them. Can we still speak of application in this organic exchange? Should we not rather speak another language, and say that there exists between mathematics and the natural sciences another relation, a relation of constitution, mathematics being neither a tool nor an instrument, nor a method, nor a language at the service of the sciences, but an active participant in the existence of the sciences, in their constitution? One word in place of another, constitution in place of application, it does not seem like much. Yet this is how philosophy proceeds. One word is enough to open up the space for a question that has not been posed. The new word throws the old words into disorder and creates a space for the new question. The new question calls into question the old answers, and the old questions lurking behind them. A new view of things is thus attained. It may be the same with the word constitution, if it is correct. Be relations of constitution. Let us take the case in all its generality, the intervention of one science, or a part of a science, in the practice of another science. These relations are typical of contemporary scientific phenomena. Increasingly, so-called neighboring disciplines are brought into play in zones which were once considered to be definitive frontiers. From these new relations new disciplines are born: physical chemistry, biophysics, biochemistry, etc. These new disciplines are often the indirect result of the development of new branches within the classical disciplines. Thus atomic physics had its effects on chemistry and biology. In conjunction with the progress of organic chemistry, it contributed to the birth of biochemistry. These exchanges are organic relations constituted between the different scientific disciplines without external philosophical intervention. They obey purely scientific necessities, purely internal to the sciences under consideration. One thing is sure, these relations do not constitute what contemporary ideology calls interdisciplinary exchanges. The new disciplines, physical chemistry, biochemistry, were not the product of interdisciplinary round tables. Nor are they interdisciplinary sciences. They are either new branches of classical sciences or new sciences. We are therefore obliged to draw a line of demarcation between interdisciplinary ideology and the effective reality of the process of the mutual application and constitution of sciences. The act of drawing such a line of demarcation has both theoretical and practical implications. Theoretically, this line of demarcation clearly reveals philosophical questions. What is the application of mathematics to the sciences? What is technology? What is the application of one science to another? Why is it necessary, at first, to speak of constitution rather than of application? What concrete dialectic is at work in these complex relations? These philosophical questions can open the way to scientific problems of the history of the sciences, or rather the conditions of the processes of constitution of the sciences. Practically, this line of demarcation can have real effects, avoiding conceptions, tendencies or temptations which might lead to unthinking, interdisciplinary collaboration, and encouraging every productive practice. I will draw one final conclusion. There are false ideas about science, not simply in the heads of philosophers, but in the heads of scientists themselves, false obviousnesses that, far from being means of making progress, are in reality epistemological obstacles. Baccalaureate. They must be criticized and dispelled by showing that the imaginary solutions they offer in fact conceal real problems. But it is necessary to go still further, to recognize that it is not by chance that these false ideas reign in certain regions within the domain of scientific activity. They are non-scientific, ideological ideas and representations. They form what we will provisionally call scientific ideology, or the ideology of scientists. A philosophy capable of discerning and criticizing them can have the effect of drawing the attention of scientists to the existence and efficacy of the epistemological obstacle that this spontaneous scientific ideology represents, the representation that scientists have of their own practice, and of their relationship to their own practice. Here again philosophy does not substitute itself for science, it intervenes, in order to clear a path, to open the space in which a correct line may then be drawn. From this I draw thesis 21. Scientific ideology, or the ideology of scientists, is inseparable from scientific practice. It is the spontaneous ideology of scientific practice. Here again I anticipate. I will explain. I have only one more word to say about this spontaneous ideology. We will see that it is spontaneous, because it is not. One of philosophy's little surprises. 2. Relations between scientific and literary disciplines. These relations are proliferating in a spectacular manner. To make them visible we will again bring into play the difference between our two categories, application and constitution. For example, formally, one might compare the public relationship between mathematics and the human sciences to the relationship just discussed between mathematics and the natural sciences. But there is a great difference. In the case of the human sciences, the relationship with mathematics is manifestly, in whole or in part, an external, non-organic relationship. In short, a technical relation of application. In the natural sciences, the question of the conditions of application of mathematics, and hence of the legitimacy of this application, and of its technical forms, is not a problematic question. Philosophy can pose questions, but it does not create problems for scientific practice. In contrast, in the human sciences this question is most often problematic. Some spiritualist philosophers contest the very possibility of a mathematicization of the human sciences. Others contest the technical forms of this application. It is this problematic character, this hesitation, that is expressed in the wish for interdisciplinarity and in the expression interdisciplinary exchange. The notion of interdisciplinarity indicates not a solution but a contradiction, the fact of the relative exteriority of the disciplines placed in relation. This exteriority, mathematics as a tool that is to a greater or lesser extent adaptable, expresses the problematic character of these relations, or of their technical forms. What use is being made of mathematics in psychology, in political economy, in sociology, in history? What complicities are in fact being established behind the prestige of the use of mathematics? As we go on asking questions, we finally arrive at the conclusion that this exteriority expresses and betrays the uncertainty which the majority of the human sciences feel concerning their theoretical status. This generalized impatience to embrace mathematics as a symptom, they have not attained theoretical maturity. Is this simply an infantile disorder, to be explained by the relative youth of the human sciences? Or is it more serious? Is it an indication that the human sciences, for the most part, miss their object, that they are not based on their true distinctive foundation, that there is a sort of misrecognition between the human sciences and their pretensions, that they miss the object that they claim to grasp because, paradoxically, this object, or at least the object they take as their own, does not exist? All these questions are supported by the real experiences from which Kant, in another time, had drawn the lesson for theology, but also for rational psychology and rational cosmology. There may exist sciences whose objects do not exist. There may exist sciences without an object, in the strict sense. 4 new distinctions should be made here, but, as always, I must anticipate. I will therefore take the risk of pronouncing upon the phenomenon as a whole, and take a position. I say, in the majority of the human sciences, mathematizing inflation is not a childhood illness, but a desperate attempt to fill a fundamental gap. With some distinct exceptions, the human sciences are sciences without an object, in the strict sense. They have a false or equivocal theoretical base, they produce long discourses and numerous findings, but because they are too confident that they know of what they are the sciences, in fact they do not know what they are the sciences of, a misunderstanding. But let us leave relations of application, and move on to relations of constitution. These may be seen today in a discipline traditionally considered a branch of philosophy, logic. Today logic has become mathematical logic, making it, in fact, independent of philosophy. It has a status of its own. In a certain sense it might be compared to the new borderline disciplines that are to be seen in the natural sciences, such as physical chemistry or biophysics. Mathematical logic is a branch of mathematics, but as a scientific discipline it functions above all in the human sciences. It is, or can be, the object of applications in a whole series of literary disciplines: linguistics, semiology, psychoanalysis, literary history. Here too there is a whole series of questions. From these summary and general remarks, some conclusions may be drawn. It may be said that between the human sciences and the natural sciences, and above all between the human sciences and mathematics, on the one hand, and mathematical logic, on the other, there exist relations formally similar to the relations that exist between the exact sciences, with the double phenomena that we have observed, application and constitution. But that this relation is far more external, and therefore technical, non-organic, than the relations that exist between the exact sciences themselves. That this exteriority seems to authorize an expression such as the notion of interdisciplinary exchanges and therefore the notion of interdisciplinarity, but that this notion is in all probability an illusory name for a problem entirely different to the problem it designates. That, at the same time, the use of certain philosophies by the human sciences seems necessary to the establishment of this relation. Here again we see a new and important index. Whereas in the exact sciences everything proceeds without any visible intervention on the part of philosophy and its apparatus, in the human sciences the structure of relations between the sciences and the human sciences seems to require, for ill-explained and therefore confused reasons, the intrusive intervention of this third character, that is philosophy, in person. Let us note an important point here. 1. The human sciences use philosophical categories and subordinate them to their objectives. They get through a lot of philosophy, but the initiative seems not to come from philosophy. Appearances suggest that this is not a matter of a critical intervention on the part of philosophy in the ideological problems of the human sciences, but, on the contrary, an exploitation by the human sciences of certain philosophical categories or philosophies. 2. It is not a question of philosophy, in general, but of very determinate categories or philosophies: idealist, positivist, neo-positivist, structuralist, formalist, phenomenological, etc., or spiritualist. 3. The philosophies or philosophical categories thus exploited by the human sciences are used practically by them as an ideological substitute for the theoretical base they lack. 4. But then the following question may be posed: is not the philosophical practice borrowed by the human sciences at the same time an appearance? Should we not reverse the order of things? and in the necessary complicity between the human sciences and these idealist philosophies. Are not the philosophies in command? Are not the human sciences sciences without an object, because they do no more than realize, in their object, determinate idealist philosophical tendencies rooted in the practical ideologies of our time, that is, of our society? Are sciences without objects simply philosophies disguised as sciences? After all, that would seem to be a fairly convincing argument since, as we know, philosophy has no object. In any event, the thesis that philosophies serve as an ideological substitute for the theoretical foundations that the human sciences lack holds for the majority of the human sciences, not for all, for there are exceptions, for example psychoanalysis and, to a certain extent, linguistics, etc. I remind you also that this thesis does not imply that certain aspects, procedures and even certain findings of the human sciences cannot possess a positive value. Each case has to be examined in detail, but that is no more than an internal and minor aspect of an overall investigation. It follows from this that the proportion of dubious ideas increases as we move from relations between the exact sciences to relations between the exact sciences and the human sciences. We dealt earlier with localized and localizable false ideas. Now we have no real grounds for speaking of false ideas, but we can speak of generalized suspect ideas. The exploitation of certain philosophies is in direct proportion to the suspect character of these ideas. What we might call scientific ideologies and philosophical ideologies assume an extreme importance in the domain of the human sciences. Not only do these ideologies exist and have great importance in our world, but they directly govern the scientific practices of the human sciences. They take the place of theory in the human sciences. Hence the importance of a philosophy capable of drawing a line of demarcation which will traverse the domain of the majority of human sciences, to help distinguish true sciences from would-be sciences, and to distinguish their de facto ideological foundations from the de jure theoretical foundations, provisionally defined in negative terms, which might make them something other than sciences without an object. Hence the importance of our position, which now becomes clear. This task cannot be undertaken and successfully completed in the name of the philosophies that the human sciences think they are exploiting, whereas they are in fact their garrulous slaves. It can be undertaken only in the name of another, completely different, philosophy. The line of demarcation thus runs through philosophy itself. 3. Relations between literary disciplines. These relations have always been numerous and close. They are apparently in the midst of fundamental change. If this is true, it is because the disciplines of the human sciences are in the midst of fundamental change, at least, that is what they claim. Let us take a closer look. Traditionally, literary disciplines have rested on a very particular relation to their object, a practical relation of utilization, appreciation, of taste, or, if you prefer, consumption. Bell's letters, the humanities and the teaching practices and research that have been attached to them for centuries, make them a school of culture. This means two things. 1. The relation between literary disciplines and their object, literature properly speaking, the fine arts, history, logic, philosophy, ethics, religion, has as its dominant function not so much the knowledge of this object, but rather the definition and inculcation of rules, norms and practices designed to establish cultural relations between the literate and these objects. Above all, to know how to handle these objects in order to consume them properly. To know how to read, that is, taste, appreciate, a classical text, to know how to apply the lessons of history, to know how to apply the right method to think well, logic, to know how to look to correct ideas, philosophy, in order to know where we stand in relation to the great questions of human existence, science, ethics, religion, etc. Through their particular relations, the arts or humanities thus impart a certain knowledge, savoir, not a scientific knowledge of their object, and not a scientific knowledge of the mechanism of their object, but, in addition to the particular erudition needed for familiarity, a savoir-faire or, to be more accurate, a know-how to do to appreciate, judge, and enjoy, consume, utilize this object which is properly culture, a knowledge invested in a knowing how to do in order to. For in this couple, what is secondary and, although not negligible, superficial, formal, is knowledge. What matters is the knowing how to do in order to. Basically, the arts were there for the pedagogical site par excellence, or, in other words, a site for cultural training, learning to think properly, to judge properly, to enjoy properly, and to behave properly towards all the cultural objects involved in human existence. There go. The well-bred gentleman, the man of culture. 2. The practical relation of consumption that exists between literary disciplines and their object cannot be considered a relation of scientific knowledge, connaissance. The culture provided by the humanities in their different forms, literature, logic, history, ethics, philosophy, etc., was never any more than the commentary made on certain consecrated objects by the culture that exists in society itself. To understand the meaning of the culture provided by the humanities, it is necessary to question not the humanities themselves, or not only the humanities, but the culture which exists in the society that cultivates these arts, the class functions of that culture, and therefore the class divisions of that society. The culture taught in the schools is in fact never anything more than a second-degree culture, a culture that cultivates, for the benefit of a greater or lesser number of individuals in this society, and with reference to certain privileged objects, belles letters, the arts, logic, philosophy, etc., the art of relating to those objects as a practical means of inculcating in those individuals defined norms of practical behavior with respect to the institutions and values of that society and to the events that occur within it. Culture is the elite and/or mass ideology of a given society. Not the real ideology of the masses, for, as a result of class oppositions, there are several tendencies within culture, but the ideology that the ruling class seeks to inculcate, directly or indirectly, through education or other means, and on a discriminatory basis, one culture for the elite, one for the popular masses, into the masses they dominate. We are speaking here of an enterprise of hegemonic character, Gramsci, obtaining the consent of the masses through the diffusion of ideology, through the presentation and inculcation of culture. The dominant ideology is always imposed on the masses against certain tendencies in their own culture which are neither recognized nor sanctioned, but do resist. This idea of the arts is not in accordance with the received idea. We should not be content to take the arts at their word and accept the definition they give of themselves. Behind the literary disciplines there is a long heritage, that of the humanities. To understand the humanities, we must seek out the meaning of the culture they dispense in the norms of the forms of behavior that are dominant in the society under consideration, religious, moral, juridical, political, etc., ideology, in short, in practical ideologies. With this implication, the literary culture dispensed by the teaching that goes on in schools is not a purely academic phenomenon. It is one moment in the ideological education of the popular masses. Through its means and effects, it intersects with other ideologies mobilized at the same time, religious, juridical, moral, political, etc. The many ideological means by which the ruling class achieves hegemony and thus holds power are all grouped around the state over which the ruling class holds power. This connection, one might say this synchronization, between literary culture, which is the objective of the classical humanities, and the mass ideological action exercised by the church, the state, law, and by the forms of the political regime, etc., are, of course, usually masked. But it comes to light during great political and ideological crises in which, for example, educational reforms are openly recognized as revolutions in the methods of ideological action deployed against the masses. At such times, it can be clearly seen that education is directly related to the dominant ideology, and it is apparent that its conception, its orientation and control are an important stake in the class struggle. Some examples: the Convention's educational reform, Jules Ferry's educational reforms, the educational reforms that so preoccupied Lenin and Krupskaya, the educational reforms of the Cultural Revolution, etc. But the sciences too are a teaching object. The arts, by which I mean the humanities, as defined by their long history, are therefore not the only subject matter of cultural, that is, ideological, training. The teaching of the sciences is also the site of a similar cultural training, although it takes more subtle, infinitely less visible form. But the way the exact sciences themselves are taught implies a certain ideological relation to their existence and their content. There is no teaching of pure knowledge, savoir, that is not at the same time a savoir-faire, that is, the definition of a know-how to act in relation to this knowledge, and to its theoretical and social function. This know-how implies a political attitude towards the object of knowledge, towards knowledge as object, and towards its place in society. All science teaching, whether it wants to or not, conveys an ideology of science and of its findings, that is, a certain knowing how to act in relation to science and its findings, based on a certain idea of the place of science in society, and on a certain idea of the role of intellectuals who specialize in scientific knowledge, and therefore of the division between manual and intellectual labor. For intellectuals, nothing could be more difficult than perceiving the ideology conveyed by education, and by its curriculum, its forms and its practices. This applies to the sciences as well as the arts. Intellectuals live in culture, just as fish live in water, but fish cannot see the water in which they swim. Everything about them militates against their having any accurate perception of the social position of the culture in which they are steeped, of the teaching which dispenses it, or of the disciplines they practice, to say nothing of the positions they occupy in this society as intellectuals, academics or research workers. Everything militates against it. The effects of the division of labor, primarily the division between manual and intellectual labor, but also divisions within intellectual labor, divisions between intellectual specialisms, the impressive immediacy of the object of their activity, which absorbs all their attention, and the character of their practice, which is at once extremely concrete and extremely abstract, etc. Their practice, which they carry out in a framework defined by laws that they do not control, thus spontaneously produces an ideology which they live without having any reason to break out of it. But matters do not end there. Their own ideology, the spontaneous ideology of their practice, their ideology of science or the arts, does not depend solely on their own practice. It depends mainly and in the last instance on the dominant ideological system of the society in which they live. Ultimately, it is this ideological system especially that governs the very forms of their ideology of science and of the arts. What seems to happen before their eyes happens, in reality, behind their backs. But let us return to the arts. For some time, since the 18th century, but in an infinitely more rapid and accelerated fashion in the last few years, relations between literary disciplines have apparently undergone a fundamental change. It is a primarily practical, that is, ideological and political relation. From all sides the literary disciplines proclaim that this relationship has changed. It would seem to have become scientific. Even if it is highly inconsistent, this phenomenon is visible in the majority of the disciplines known as the human sciences. We are not speaking of logic. Logic has been displaced and is now a part of mathematics. But linguistics, at least in some of its regions, seems to have become a science. Even the credentials of psychoanalysis, for a long time condemned and banished, have begun to be recognized. Other disciplines also claim to have attained the level of scientificity: political economy, sociology, psychology, history. Literary history itself has been given a new lease of life, and has put the tradition of the humanities behind it. It is on the basis of this contradictory situation that we can begin to understand the relations which are currently being tentatively established between the different literary disciplines. They lay claim to the name of human sciences, marking with the word sciences their claims to having broken off their old relationship with their object. Instead of a cultural, that is, ideological, relation, they want to install a new relation, scientific. On the whole, they think they have succeeded in this conversion and proclaim it in the name they give themselves, by baptizing themselves human sciences. But a proclamation may be no more than a proclamation, an intention, or a program. It may also be in part a myth designed to sustain an illusion, or a wish fulfillment. it is not certain that the human sciences have really changed their nature by changing their name and their methods. The relations that are currently being established between the literary disciplines are proof of that. The systematic mathematicization of a number of disciplines, economics, sociology, psychology, and the application of disciplines manifestly more advanced in scientificity to others, the pioneering role of mathematical logic, and especially linguistics, the equally intrusive role of psychoanalysis, etc. Contrary to what has occurred in the natural sciences, in which relations are generally organic, this kind of application remains external, instrumental, technical, and therefore suspect. The most aberrant contemporary example of the external application of a method, which in its universality is following fashion, to any object whatsoever, is structuralism. When disciplines are in search of a universal method, we may wager that they are a little too anxious to demonstrate their scientific credentials really to have earned them. True sciences never need to let the world know that they have found the key to becoming sciences. Another sensitive point in this equivocal process appears in the relation that exists between disciplines and philosophy. The human sciences that are being constituted openly exploit certain philosophies. They seek in these philosophies, for example in phenomenology, whose influence is on the wane, in structuralism, not to mention in Hegelianism and even Nietzscheanism, a base of support and a way of orientating themselves. That is what they are looking for in philosophy, even when they aggressively reject all philosophy. Though, given their current state, theirs is a philosophical rejection of philosophy, a variety of positivism. As we have seen, this relation may be reversed. It is only because they themselves realize the dominant ideology that the human sciences can exploit philosophy or the other disciplines that stand in for philosophy. Thus linguistics and psychoanalysis function increasingly as philosophies for literary history, semiology, etc. In all this to-ing and fro-ing something appears, if we are willing to see it, as an absence, a lack, the very thing which the sciences need if they are to deserve the name of science, a recognition of their theoretical base. These relationships, whether direct or indirect, bring us back to our term and our question, interdisciplinarity. This myth enjoys a wide currency in the human sciences and in general. Sociology, economics, psychology, linguistics and literary history constantly borrow notions, methods and procedures from existing disciplines, whether literary or scientific. We are speaking of the eclectic practice of holding interdisciplinary round tables. All the neighbors are invited, no one is forgotten, one never knows. Inviting everyone so as to leave no one out means that we do not know precisely who to invite, where we are or where we are going. The practice of round tables is necessarily accompanied by an ideology of the virtues of interdisciplinarity, of which it is the counterpoint and the mass. This ideology is contained in a formula: when one does not know what the world does not know, it suffices to assemble all the ignorant. Science will emerge from an assembly of the ignorant. Am I joking? This practice is in flagrant contradiction with what we know of the process of constitution of real sciences, including new sciences. They are never born out of specialists' round tables. In fact, this practice and its ideology are in accordance with what we know of the processes of domination of ideologies. When everyone is invited, it is not the hope for new science that is being invited, for it is never the result of a gathering of specialists who are ignorant of it, but a character no one has invited, and whom it is not necessary to invite, since it invites itself. The common theoretical ideology that silently inhabits the consciousness of all these specialists, when they gather together, it speaks out loud, through their voice. Apart from certain specific cases, most often technical, where this practice has its place, when a discipline makes a justified request of another on the basis of real organic links between disciplines, interdisciplinarity therefore remains a magical practice, in the service of an ideology, in which scientists, or would-be scientists, formulate an imaginary idea of the division of scientific labor, of the relations between sciences and the conditions of discovery, to give the impression of grasping an object that escapes them. Very concretely, interdisciplinarity is usually the slogan and the practice of the spontaneous ideology of specialists, oscillating between a vague spiritualism and technocratic positivism. Concerning all this, there are false ideas to be avoided in order to open the way to the correct ideas. Once again, it is necessary to ask what the application of one science to another, of determinate methods to a new object in the literary disciplines, might consist of. Once again, it is even more necessary to examine the nature of the pre-existing ideology and to penetrate its current disguises. Finally, it is necessary to pose the question of questions: are the human sciences, with certain limited exceptions, what they think they are, that is, sciences? Or are they in their majority something else, namely ideological techniques of social adaptation and readaptation? If this is in fact what they are, they have not, as they claim, broken with their former ideological and political cultural function. They act through other, more sophisticated, perfected techniques, but still in the service of the same cause. It will suffice to note the direct relation they maintain with a whole series of other techniques, such as human relations and modern forms of mass media, to be convinced that this hypothesis is not an imaginary one. But then, it is not simply the status of the human sciences that is in question, but the status of the theoretical basis that they claim to have provided for themselves. Question: what makes up the apparatus that permits disciplines to function as ideological techniques? This is the question that philosophy poses. Let us summarize the lessons that can be drawn from this simple example: interdisciplinarity. What in fact does the slogan of interdisciplinarity mask? 1. Certain real practices, perfectly founded and legitimate, practices that remain to be defined, in cases that remain to be defined. To define them is to distinguish them from others. The first line of demarcation. 2. In the interior of these practices and these real problems, there are new distinctions to be made, application, constitution, and therefore new lines of demarcation to be drawn. 3. Outside these real practices, we encounter the pretensions of certain disciplines that declare themselves to be sciences, human sciences. What are we to make of their pretensions? By means of a new line of demarcation we distinguish between the real function of most of the human sciences and the ideological character of their pretensions. 4. If we go back to the slogan of interdisciplinarity, we are now in a position to state, on the basis of certain resistant symptoms, that it is massively ideological in character. The lesson to be drawn from this brief summary: we have made our definition of philosophy function. Philosophy states theses which draw lines of demarcation. We have been able to show that this practice, however wild, savage, as in this lecture, produces results. Everyone can agree on one thing: we have not once, for a single moment, given in to the temptation of most philosophies and philosophers. We have not exploited the findings or difficulties of the sciences for the greater glory of a truth or the truth. In this way we have demarcated ourselves from the dominant philosophical currents, and we have marked out our own position. If we have respected the sciences and their findings, and if philosophy is an intervention, where have we intervened? Note well, each time we have intervened, it has been to draw a line of demarcation. Further, each time we have drawn a line of demarcation, it has been to make something appear that was not visible before our intervention. What? The existence, reality, consistency and function of what we have called theoretical or scientific ideology, or, better still, the spontaneous ideology of the practice of scientists or supposed scientists. And behind these forms of ideology, other forms, practical ideologies, and the dominant ideology. But just as it makes the ideological appear, the line of demarcation makes it possible to recognize, on the other side of the divide, the scientific that is obscured by the ideological, by extricating it. The ideological is something that relates to practice and to society. The scientific is something that relates to knowledge, connaissance, and to the sciences. So, where have we intervened? Very precisely, in the space where the ideological and the scientific merge but where they can and must be separated, to recognize each in its functioning and to free scientific practice from the ideological domination that blocks it. Provisionally, we can say that the essential function of the philosophy practiced on these positions is to draw lines of demarcation, all of which seem capable of introducing, in the last instance, a line of demarcation between the scientific and the ideological. From this follows Thesis 22. All the lines of demarcation traced by philosophy are ultimately modalities of a fundamental line, the line between the scientific and the ideological. We have thus shown that the result of these philosophical interventions is the production of new philosophical questions. What is the application of one science to another? The constitution of one science by another? Technology? Ideology? The relation between the ideological and the philosophical? Etc. These philosophical questions are not scientific problems. Philosophy does not encroach upon the domain of the sciences. But these philosophical questions can help to pose scientific problems, in the space that they open. Such is the gain of philosophy, as we practice it, drawing lines of demarcation that produce new philosophical questions without end. Philosophy does not respond like a science to the questions it produces, with demonstrated solutions or proven findings. In the scientific sense of these words, it responds by stating theses which are correct, not arbitrary, and which in turn draw new lines of demarcation, giving rise to new philosophical questions, ad infinitum. This much is obvious, but behind the obvious something else happens. This operation, drawing lines of demarcation to produce philosophical questions, provoking new theses, etc., is not a speculative game. It is an operation that has practical effects. What are they? Let us summarize them in one word: the line that takes the form of justified theses, which in turn give rise to an intelligible discourse that divides the scientific from the ideological, has as its practical effect the opening of a way, therefore the removal of obstacles, opening a space for a correct line for the practices that are at stake in philosophical theses. But I think this is enough for the first lecture. Lecture 2.